1492, the year the world split in two. Before 1492, the world breathed in two separate rhythms, each one complete, proud, and unaware of the other. To the east, Europe clawed its way out of centuries of war, disease, and the rigid grip of kings and popes. Cities rose again. Gold glinted in the halls of the ambitious, and on the coasts of kingdoms like Castile and Portugal, maps curled under candlelight, whispering of unknown lands, of fortunes untapped, and oceans still unclaimed. But to the west, far beyond the reach of their sails, another world already thrived. The land that would one day be called America was not empty. It was ancient, it was vast, and it was alive. Great empires carved the earth with science, art, and memory. In the south, the Inca ruled from mountaintop cities built without iron or wheels, yet with precision that modern engineers still marvel at. In the forests of Mesoamerica, the Aztec Empire shimmered with obsidian blades, golden temples, and the rhythm of chants that echoed from Tenochtitlan, a city larger than any in Europe. And further north, across rivers, plains, deserts, the Haudenosaunee, the Mississippians, the Anishinaabe, the Pueblo, and hundreds of other nations lived in systems of government, belief, and balance that no outsider had ever seen. To them, the world was not something to conquer. It was something to belong to. Children were raised with stories that connected them to stars and soil. Warriors hunted with skill, but only took what they needed. Leaders were chosen not for power, but for wisdom, for humility, for how well they listened. And above them all, the earth itself was sacred. But across the Atlantic, the old world was itching. Europe had survived the Black Death. It had endured crusades, famines, and the slow disintegration of the old feudal order. But now, it wanted more. Trade routes were closing. The Silk Road, once a golden thread that tied China to the Mediterranean, had frayed. The Ottomans controlled the eastern passages. Spices, silk, and silver became luxuries that only the bold or brutal could chase. And in the courts of Spain, two monarchs saw opportunity in the sea. Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon had only just united their kingdoms after a bloody war. The Muslims had been expelled from Granada. The Jews, unless they converted, were forced to flee. It was a new Spain, a Christian Spain, a restless Spain. So when a sailor from Genoa named Cristoforo Colombo, or as the Spanish called him, Cristobal Colon, stood before them with a plan that defied the known world, they listened. He wasn't noble, he wasn't polished, but he was convincing. Columbus claimed he could reach Asia by sailing west, not around Africa, not through the Levant, but straight into the unknown. He believed the earth was round, yes, but he also believed it was much smaller than it really was. He didn't know two vast continents sat between Europe and his goal, but he didn't care. He wasn't looking for accuracy. He was looking for approval, and more importantly, funding. And in that court of desperation and ambition, he found both. In April 1492, the Spanish crown signed the capitulations of Santa Fe, granting Columbus not only ships and men, but titles: Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy of new lands, and a tenth of all wealth he found. He was not being sent to explore, he was being sent to claim. And so the world began to tilt. 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, set sail from Palos de la Frontera in August 1492. Their crews were a mix of desperate men, ex-convicts, sailors who feared they'd fall off the edge of the world, and adventurers who dreamed of gold. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that they weren't sailing into empty waters. They were sailing toward a world that already had stories. Because across the Atlantic, the people of the western continents continued their lives, unaware that a fracture was coming. In the Taino villages of the Caribbean, canoes slid across turquoise waters. Children played in the shadows of palm trees. Tribal leaders, called caciques, governed through consensus, through tradition. They had no armies, no prisons, no concept of owning land, and no idea that ships with foreign sails were cutting across the ocean toward them. In their language, the word for heaven was Koyaba, a place of peace, a world without pain. And in 1492, they still believed they were living in it. Back in Europe, rumors spread. Priests debated whether people on the other side of the sea had souls. Merchants imagined spices, silver, and slaves. Monarchs feared being left behind. The age of exploration wasn't about curiosity. It was about control. And yet, as Columbus stared into the endless horizon each night, even he couldn't have imagined what waited ahead. It would take him more than a month. His men would grow restless. At one point, he would lie to them about how far they'd traveled, just to keep morale from breaking. But on October 12th, 1492, just before dawn, a sailor cried out, "Tierra! Tierra! Land! Land!" They had arrived, but not in India, not in Cathay. They had landed on the shores of the Bahamas, on an island the locals called Guanahani. Columbus renamed it San Salvador, as if claiming it erased its past. He stepped onto the beach, raised the Spanish flag, knelt in the sand, and declared it property of Castile and Leon. To him, it was the start of a new world. To those watching from the trees, it was the beginning of the end. Because in that moment, the first handshake, the first trade, the first gift, a fault line opened beneath history, and the world began to split in two. When the ships landed and Columbus stepped onto the sand, he didn't see a civilization. He didn't see culture, language, law, or identity. He saw opportunity. The Taino greeted the strangers with gifts, parrots, cotton, carved masks, and open hands. To them, generosity was strength. Hospitality was sacred. They believed the gods had sent these men across the sea, and so they welcomed them as guests. Columbus saw something else entirely. In his journal, he wrote, "They are very gentle and without knowledge of what is evil. They will make fine servants." From that moment, the mask of exploration slipped. It had never been about maps or stars. It was always about power, about how to extract, how to dominate, how to convert. Because behind every voyage from Europe was a burning idea that the world belonged to whoever could take it, and Columbus had every intention of taking it all. At first, he traded glass beads for gold dust, bells for food. But it was never fair. The Taino didn't value gold the same way. To them, it was decorative, not divine. They wore it as jewelry, not wealth. They saw no reason to hoard it, no lust for piles of it. And that, in the eyes of Columbus, made them exploitable. He asked where the gold came from. They pointed to other islands. He asked if there were more people. They nodded. He asked if there were kings. They described caciques, village leaders who governed with respect, not crowns. To Columbus, this meant one thing. They had no armies, and so, when he returned to Spain in 1493, he brought back more than stories. He brought gold trinkets, feathers, and most tragically, a handful of Taino captives. He paraded them before Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, told tales of rivers filled with gold, docile natives, and lands ripe for the Christian faith. He promised not just riches, but the spread of divine rule. He said the future was waiting, across the sea, unguarded. The crown believed him, and they gave him more ships, more men, more fire. When Columbus returned to the Caribbean, it wasn't with 3 ships, it was with 17. And this time, he wasn't exploring. He was conquering. The Taino, still unaware of the storm they had welcomed, met the fleet with curiosity. But now, the smiles were gone. The strangers no longer traded. They demanded. Villages were ordered to produce gold, monthly quotas enforced with violence. Those who failed had their hands cut off. Women were taken, children enslaved, entire communities burned because they refused to kneel. The promise of discovery had become the reality of domination. The Taino began to resist, not with swords, they had none, but with escape, with hiding, with rebellion. They poisoned food, fled into the forests, sabotaged Spanish outposts. But it wasn't enough. The steel and gunpowder of Europe crashed into a world that didn't believe in walls or war the way the Spaniards did. And the death toll began to rise. Some died in chains, some by blades. But most died from something they couldn't even see. Disease, smallpox, measles, influenza, viruses that had ravaged Europe for centuries now tore through the Caribbean like fire. The Taino had no immunity, no medicine, no defense. In some villages, entire populations disappeared in weeks. Before Columbus's voyage, it's estimated that the Taino population of the islands was over 300,000. 50 years later, less than 500 remained. And still, Columbus pressed on. He founded settlements, appointed himself governor, fought rival Spaniards who claimed he wasn't cruel enough, or who wanted more control. The islands became plantations, the people became property, and a system called the encomienda was born, legalizing enslavement under the disguise of Christian salvation. To the crown, the conquest had begun. To the Taino, it was the unraveling of the world. But this wasn't just a local tragedy, because word had spread. Across Europe, other kings and merchants watched Columbus's reports with envy. Portugal, England, France, they wanted a peace. They began sending their own ships, not to explore, to take. Colonies sprouted like weeds. The Atlantic became a highway for slaves, silver, sugar, and death. The world wasn't split by accident, it was split by design. In the Old World, empires swelled. In the New World, civilizations crumbled. And between them, an ocean now red with memory. It wasn't drawn in blood. Not at first. It was drawn with ink, in a quiet room, on a smooth map, far from the islands where people were dying, far from the fire, the screams, the disease. It was drawn by men in robes, seated beneath golden crosses, deciding how to divide a world they had never seen, as if it were theirs to split. The Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494, didn't just define borders. It defined history. At the urging of Spain, the Pope declared that all non-Christian lands west of a certain line, an invisible boundary carved through the Atlantic, would belong to Spain. Lands east of that line would go to Portugal. It was a simple decree, but it changed everything. Because that line sliced straight through the future. Spain raced west. Portugal claimed the coast of Africa and reached down toward Brazil. And no one, not the Inca, not the Maya, not the Tupi, not the millions of human beings living and thriving across these so-called new lands, no one had a say. Their homelands were bartered by men who'd never stepped foot there. The arrogance was staggering, but the impact was devastating. That imaginary line gave European powers a license, not to explore, but to own. And in their eyes, to own meant to control, to convert, to extract, to enslave. The Americas weren't a discovery. They were a claim. And every ship that followed Columbus carried with it the same promise. The land is ours, the people are not people, and anything that stands in the way will be removed. Across the Caribbean, across the coasts of Central and South America, that promise became prophecy. Spain sent more conquistadors, Hernán Cortés, Francisco Pizarro, men who would etch their names into history through fire and blood. Entire empires, the Aztec, the Inca, were brought to their knees not by better ideas, but by deceit, disease, and brutality masked as holy duty. In 1519, Cortés arrived in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, a city of canals, towering temples, and vibrant life that stunned even the Spaniards. But within 2 years it would lie in ruins, not because it was weak, but because it believed the strangers could be trusted. Pizarro, in 1532, captured the Inca emperor Atahualpa by pretending to negotiate. He demanded a room filled with gold as ransom. The ransom was paid. Atahualpa was still executed. These weren't military victories. They were betrayals disguised as diplomacy. And behind them all, the church cheered. Conversion became the currency of colonization. Natives were baptized at sword point. Those who resisted were labeled heretics, their temples torn down, their languages banned, their gods declared demons. The Spanish didn't just want the land. They wanted to erase the people from their own story. And yet, they survived. In whispers, in songs, in carvings hidden in caves, in languages spoken in secret, in the quiet acts of resistance that no soldier could crush. And this is where I, Uncle Luke, need to pause this story just for a second. Because if you're still here, if you're still following this tale of stolen worlds, shattered people, and the arrogance of men who thought they could draw lines through life itself, then do me a favor. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you're listening from or what history you were never told in school. Smash that like button, because this isn't just history, it's survival. And don't forget to subscribe to Uncle Luke Tells, where we uncover the stories they tried to bury, one voice at a time. Now, let's keep digging. Because while Spain and Portugal divided the world on paper, the real fracture was happening in the souls of the people living through it. Entire ways of life were being rewritten. Calendars, beliefs, even time itself was measured differently. The Spanish introduced the Gregorian calendar, declaring their timeline the true one. Native systems of measurement, farming, and storytelling were dismissed as primitive, even though they had sustained complex societies for thousands of years. In the Andes, quipu, a knotted cord system used by the Inca to record data and memory, was outlawed. In Mesoamerica, codices, sacred illustrated texts written by Mayan scribes, were burned by missionaries who called them satanic. Imagine that. Libraries older than any in Europe, destroyed in hours because they didn't match the worldview of the invaders. It wasn't just colonization, it was cultural assassination. And still, somehow, people held on. They sang in dialects passed down from grandmother to granddaughter. They tattooed symbols of lost gods beneath their clothing. They told stories in the dark, around fires, about what the world was before the ships. And even as cities were renamed, rivers remapped, mountains claimed by men who had never climbed them, the land remembered. Because memory doesn't die when you bury it. It just waits. But the colonizers were not satisfied with land alone. They needed labor. And when native populations began to collapse under disease and forced labor, their eyes turned east, across the ocean, toward Africa. And so, just a few decades after Columbus's voyage, another line was drawn. Not on maps this time, but on skin, the Atlantic slave trade was born. Millions of Africans were ripped from their homes, shackled, branded, and shipped to plantations across the Americas. It was a second wave of theft, not of land, but of bodies, of generations, of breath. The so-called New World was being built on broken backs, and the line that divided the earth, it now ran through the middle of humanity itself. They called it the New World, a phrase soaked in pride, invention, destiny. But for those who lived on that land long before the ships arrived, it was never new. It was ancient. It had names. It had stories. It had memories older than the empires that would try to erase them. But the lie was powerful. European kings spoke of civilization, of bringing order to savages, of building cities in the wilderness, as if temples hadn't already risen long before their flags. The colonizers wrote letters home filled with wonder, of vast lands, abundant soil, rivers thick with fish, forests rich with game, And always, always, they spoke of gold, the gleam of it, the promise of it, as if gold could grow where bones were buried. They promised opportunity, but they brought ruin. By the late 1500s, much of the Caribbean had been carved into Spanish fiefdoms. On the mainland, conquest campaigns turned once thriving civilizations into footnotes. Survivors were pushed into hills, forests, or under the dominion of men who believed baptism erased genocide. Jesuit missions were built over sacred ground. Catholic bells rang in places where the wind once carried prayers to other gods, and the deeper into the continent they went, the more they found, not emptiness, but complexity. In what is now the southeastern United States, the Mississippian cultures had once constructed massive earthen mounds, like Cahokia, a city with 20,000 people and astronomical alignment. In the southwest, the Pueblo peoples had built complex cliff dwellings with systems of trade stretching from Mexico to the Rockies. In the Amazon, explorers would find vast networks of forest villages, many of which had already vanished under vines by the time Europe discovered them. The New World was older, wiser, and more interconnected than anyone from Europe ever imagined. But no one listened. The Old World had already decided what the New World was supposed to be. Plantations replaced forests, slaves replaced citizens, mines tore open the mountains, whole peoples became categories in ledgers. The colonial system wasn't built on exploration, it was built on extraction, of land, of labor, of identity. And yet even within the colonial cities, the ones with cathedrals, stone roads, and Spanish names, the Old World refused to die. In the kitchens of those cities, enslaved African women whispered songs from home. In the fields, native farmers planted seeds passed down for generations. Even as colonizers tried to erase languages, children still learned them in whispers. And when uprisings came, as they always did, they came not just from rage, but from memory. Because history once buried doesn't disappear. It waits. And in that waiting, a question began to rise, slowly at first, then louder with each generation. What if the new world they promised was never meant for us? What if it wasn't a land of freedom, but a system built to keep freedom out of reach? By the 1600s, European settlers began flooding the eastern coast of North America. British, Dutch, French, all claiming land discovered centuries before. Colonies sprouted with names like Virginia, New Amsterdam, and Quebec. And with them came laws, guns, and a cold, organized system of racial hierarchy. Native Americans were pushed from their land, relocated or slaughtered when they resisted. African slaves were worked to death, sold like tools, stripped of family and name. Even poor Europeans, promised land and liberty, found themselves trapped in debt, indentured servitude, and the whims of colonial lords. And still, the myth of the New World persisted. They painted it with words like manifest destiny, frontier, civilization. They called it the birth of freedom, even as chains rattled in the background. They built colleges while banning native children from learning. They wrote constitutions while owning slaves. They celebrated liberty while committing genocide. It was a world of contradictions, of beauty and brutality, of invention and erasure. But beneath it all, under every farm, every city, every church steeple, the earth still remembered. In the Andes, descendants of the Inca still trace their ancestry through stone ruins and hidden springs. In the Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean traditions blended Yoruba, Taino, and Christian rituals into living syncretic religions like Santeria and Vodou. In North America, native nations like the Haudenosaunee, the Cherokee, and the Lakota rebuilt their identities through treaties, resistance, and story. Because culture doesn't die when you try to burn it. It transforms. And while the colonizers wrote books, the colonized remembered. They remembered the world before the ships, the silence of the forests, the rhythm of seasons unbroken by fences, the names of rivers that have since been renamed by men who never knew them. And they remembered 1492, not as a discovery, but as a fracture. Not as the birth of a new world, but as the wound that split the old one open. By the 1700s, revolution began to stir. Colonies once loyal to crowns started to question their chains. But the question wasn't just political, it was moral. Could a nation be built on stolen land? Could freedom exist while others were enslaved? Could a future be honest if it refused to confront its past? And the truth that Columbus's voyage had made unavoidable, was this. The world had been split in two. But it didn't have to stay that way. 1492 didn't end. It didn't stop when the ships left. It didn't stop when Columbus died. It didn't stop when the treaties were signed, the cities built, or the maps redrawn. Because some years never really end. They ripple. They echo in ways that history books don't explain. In the way land is owned, in the languages we forget, in the stories we were never taught. 1492 was never just a year. It was a dividing line, one drawn not in ink or blood, but in belief. A belief that one part of the world had the right to name, claim, and change the other. A belief that discovery was a gift, even if it came wrapped in chains. A belief that history starts when someone writes it down, even if millions lived it before a single word was recorded. And that belief is still with us. You can hear it in how we tell the story, in how we celebrate Columbus Day in some places and mourn it in others, in how we call people illegal on land their ancestors walked before borders ever existed, in how we still argue over statues and names, as if acknowledging pain is the same as erasing pride. The truth is uncomfortable, because the world we live in, the borders we respect, the languages we speak, the systems we move through, are all shaped by that moment, by those ships, by that line. The descendants of those who crossed the ocean now live beside the descendants of those who were already here. And those whose ancestors were dragged here in chains built the very foundations of the so-called New World. Their blood is in the bricks, their names erased from the documents, but their fingerprints are everywhere. And still we treat 1492 like a beginning, instead of a break. But here's the secret. Every break leaves a chance to rebuild. Because though the fracture was violent, something else survived. Something deeper, older. And it's still beating beneath the surface of this world. Memory. You can see it in the resurgence of native languages, in the drum circles that still echo through the forests, in the crops grown the old way, in the stories whispered by grandmothers in homes where no colonizer's god ever reigned. You can hear it in the resistance songs, in the fusion foods, in the art that carries both pain and pride. You can feel it in movements for justice, for land back, for remembrance, not as revenge, but as restoration. Because people never forget where they come from, even when the world tries to make them. And even in the places where Columbus planted his flag, there are people now planting seeds of something new, something better. 1492 was the year the world split in two. But today, there are those trying to stitch it back together. Not by forgetting, but by remembering fully. By telling the story not from one side, but from all of them. Because history doesn't belong to the winners. It belongs to the listeners. To the ones who ask, what really happened? To the ones who look past the flag and into the faces of those who were made invisible. To the ones like you, still here, still watching, still questioning, and if you're one of them, you've already taken the first step. So here's what I want you to do. If this story moved you, opened your eyes, or made you feel something you weren't expecting, drop a comment below, share a name, a place, a piece of history you think more people should hear. Like this video, not for the algorithm, but because remembering matters. Subscribe to Uncle Luke Tells. Because these stories, they're not done. We've got more. So many more. And here's the final truth. 1492 wasn't the end of one world and the start of another. It was the moment we were forced to choose to believe the lie, or to search for the truth, to forget, or to remember, to repeat, or to rebuild. You know what choice we've made. Now, what about you?